Hi there, this is Kevin Patton with a brief audio introduction to episode 41 of the A&P Professor podcast, also known as TAPP Radio, an audio medicine show and revival meeting for teachers of human anatomy and physiology. Well, in episode 41, it turns out that we're revisiting and updating some interesting topics from past episodes. For example, I have a brief update on growing new neurons in the adult brain. Yes, that again. And there's more on finding media to use in teaching A&P. And that was sparked by a question from listener Adam Rich. And the featured topic is more on eponyms in A&P terminology, featuring a contribution by Mike Pasco. And speaking of names, I'll have a brief segment on what we call our students. That's all in the upcoming full episode, which is episode 41. The free distribution of this podcast is sponsored by the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology instruction, the Happy degree. If your training didn't include teaching practice or didn't include both anatomy and physiology of all the major body systems, then you may want to check out this online graduate program at nycc.edu/happy, that's HAPI, or click the link in the show notes or episode page. Well, it's time for some word dissections. And since this is a recurring segment, I was thinking maybe I need some kind of a snappy jingle or something to play during this part. Now that I'm saying it out loud and giving it more thought, maybe that's not such a good idea. Well, anyway, I have two terms that are going to be coming up in the full episode. The first term can be pronounced either of two different ways: duodenum or duodenum. And as you know, that's the first major subdivision of the small intestine. And duodenum is derived from the Latin word duodeni, which means 12, but it's actually shortened from a longer Latin phrase, which is intestinum duodenum digitorum, or the 12 finger widths of the intestine. And it kind of gets that name because it's that first very short segment of the small intestine. It's only 12 finger widths. That's sort of the implication, is it's only 12 finger widths. And of course, that's not necessarily literally true. That's going to vary from person to person, not only in length of duodenum, but in the width of the fingers. I mean, whose fingers are they? And what's interesting to me is, why do they have 12 of them? I mean, I only have 10. And I know some people have more than that, but that's the exception rather than the rule. So why did somebody think that that was a handy way, and forgive the pun there, a handy way to label this segment? You know, you always have to borrow 2 extra fingers, don't you, to kind of figure out where that is? I mean, of course, you don't have to figure out where it is because the C shape of it tells you where it is. But to me, this whole thing just seems like an odd way to name that segment. But of course, I have an odd outlook on just about anything myself, so who am I to say? By the way, the plural of the term duodenum or duodenum is duodena, that is with an A. But duodenums or duodenums is also acceptable. So it's one of those where we can either revert to the Latin way to make something plural or use the English way by just adding an S. Our second term is hippocampus. And as you probably know, that's a fold of the cerebral cortex that on a cross-section sort of resembles a seahorse. And it forms part of the limbic system, or emotional brain. And if we break it down, well, I think I've kind of spoiled the surprise here if you don't know what hippocampus means literally. the first part, hippo, means horse. And you might think, wait a minute, what about a hippopotamus? That's what I think of, not a horse. Well, yeah, hippopotamus comes from hippo, horse, and potamus, which means river. And so it's a river horse. And if you've ever seen a hippo, either at a zoo or in the wild, they are big, sort of like a horse, and they kind of hang out near rivers, or at least bodies of water. Not just near them, but also in them. And so hippo, that first part means horse, and the last part, campus, means sea monster. So hippocampus literally means sea monster horse, or we can interpret it as seahorse. So once you know that meaning, it's kind of easy to remember sort of what it looks like in a lot of diagrams and preparations of the hippocampus. This podcast is sponsored by HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. Go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. That's HAPS. I'll be at the HAPS annual conference in Portland, and I hope to see you there too. In case you were wondering, yes, I do have a recommendation from the A&P Professor Book Club. It's a book that I'm just finishing up, and I've really enjoyed it. It's called Skeleton Keys, The Secret Life of Bone. It's written by Brian Switek, who has a paleobiology background. And that's a little bit different perspective than I think many of us who are teaching A&P have. And I think that works out great because he's telling the story of bone from a slightly different angle than many of us would be coming from on our own. And I think that's going to give us a fresh perspective and a different way of looking at many different aspects of bone. And speaking of storytelling, I'm coming back to that again. Longtime listeners know that storytelling is a big deal for me because I think that when we're teaching A&P, or teaching anything for that matter, we need to think of ourselves as storytellers. And not just in giving lectures or mini lectures or explanations, but in every aspect of putting our course together and providing resources for students. It is a story. It's a story of human structure and function. In this book, Brian Switek is telling the story of bone. And of course, because he's writing a book, it is more obviously written in a storytelling format. And that's part of what makes it so interesting. But for me, the most interesting part is how he is approaching even some of the basic ideas of bone that we're teaching in our own class. The basic structure of bone, the basic function of bone, how bone interacts with other parts of our body, and what role it plays in helping us do what we do as humans to stay alive. And what it has done for me is give me some other ways to look at that story that I will likely be incorporating in my own story of bone. So not only is it a good refresher of the basics of bone, but because it's being told in a storytelling format and from a different angle than I would have come from, it's going to be a great resource for, I think, all of us who are teaching A&P, to hear it from somebody else's perspective. But not only that, there's a lot of the paleobiology stuff and so on that I didn't know, or I was just barely aware of, and didn't realize how important it is in the story of bone. And I might be adding a little bit of that into my own story in A&P. Now I'm going to have to figure out how to do that without my course becoming a bone course. So if you want to take a look at this book, go to the approfessor.org/book club, or just hit the link in the show notes or episode page and take a look at this book. I highly recommend it. It's been a fun read. A searchable transcript and a captioned audiogram of this preview episode are funded by AAA, the American Association of Anatomists, at anatomy.org. And I want to give a special shout out to all my friends who are at the AAA conference at the Experimental Biology meeting in Orlando right now. Okay, I'm not going to actually shout. Just wish you all a good adventure. Well, this is Kevin Patton signing off for now and reminding you to keep your questions and comments coming. Why not call the podcast hotline right now at 1-833-LION-DEN. That's 1-833-546-6336. Or visit us at theapprofessor.org. See you down the road.